Lord Seventh, is a priest novel. This is an audiobook made by fans for other fans. Disclaimer. The main couple of the story is made up of two men. If you don't like it, don't listen. Thank you. Remember, subscribe and click the bell to stay updated on all the new releases. Enjoy. Chapter 7. A lively scene. Wuxia withdrew his clenched fists into his sleeves, nails digging right into his palm. That high and mighty man had one hand propping up his chin, his faint smiling look making him feel indescribably uncomfortable. He thought that the way he was looking at him resembled that of those nobles watching kittens and puppies providing them amusement. The tall, elevated ceiling of the great hall was like a small stretch of sky, and the dragons on its main pillars looked alive, spiraling upwards to charge directly into the heavens. Everyone's line of sight patronizingly landed upon him. He had always believed himself to be unperturbed, as he had learned quite a lot from the great shaman and knew what was right from what was wrong, but he had never been as unable to control himself as he was now. In Nanjiang, the great shaman was like their god, and the clansmen revered him just as they revered Gez. The shamanette was the great shaman of tomorrow, said to be a young emissary that came from the heavens, picked from thousands of choices. They leave their home to be raised from childhood at the great shaman's side and learn all kinds of things. In the eyes of the clansmen, he was no less venerable just because he was a child. It was like his chi and blood were vainly bubbling up in his heart, going berserk as if they wished to break free of his body and head towards all the ones here who were so irreverent towards him. He tilted his head down, but caught sight of Ashenly and the rest's expressions. His brave kinsmen and fighters were standing modestly, sorrow and rage that they dared to feel yet didn't dare to vocalize on their faces. These men, who would never draw a step back in the face of a feral beast or venomous snake, had to raise their heads up high to be able to see those high-flown folk as they stood here now. Just like tiny bugs that a group of people were given free rein to stomp on. Taking in a deep breath, he used his tongue that was not so marvelous at speaking Mandarin to slowly do just that. What the emperor states, likely is shaman craft of Central Plains people. Our Nanjiang does not have it. Oh? What do you practice, then? Wuxia gave him a determined look. No need to mention Helian Pei, who his gaze was directed at, but even Jing Qi, who was standing to the side, also couldn't help but feel that the look in the kid's eyes was very bizarre. It had something unusually nefarious in it, and seeing it made one rather uncomfortable at their core. It was completely unlike the one other children had that incurred fondness. The boy stood up. May I perform for Emperor to see? Helian Pei quickly nodded. Go on. Do you need any supplementary materials? The boy said nothing, his exposed eyes slightly curving as if he had smiled. Nevertheless, Jing Qi couldn't keep from frowning, and Wuxia just so happened to see that when he went to turn around. It was only then that he noticed that there was a faintly leaning, non-attention grabbing child stationed at the Central Plains Emperor's side. Even so, he only subtly swept his eyes over him, turned, then walked a few steps over to stand firm next to that minister of rights, Jian Xizong. He raised his head, curving his two big and black eyes, and placed a hand on his own chest to give him a salute. Jian Xizong didn't know what he meant by this, simply furrowing his brow as he sized him up and down. All of a sudden, the man felt slightly off. Things were blurry, as if something was covering the view before him. He swiftly took a few steps back, a peal of buzzing sounds in his ears, and looked every which way at a loss. He could not clearly discern the people that were almost within reach of him. He intrinsically knew that this was the toddler's doing, and he pointed at Wuxia in rage, fear, and fury intermingling. You. Yet, when he looked again, what black-clothed, masked toddler? Before him was clearly a peach-clothed woman in her prime. He only saw her smile at him, revealing a row of pearly whites, with light pink flying high on her cheeks and her eyebrows slightly lowered, the charm giving her an unspeakable grace. The corners of her eyes were just like long hooks, giving her some semblance to that famous beauty, Xiao Heiyu, from Old Willow Lane. Jian Saizong's face turned red with a dong. He saw the beauty take a few paces forward, reaching up to undress, and his mind went a strange path. How could a lewd strumpet like this be in a wide open, public area and still be so daring with no consideration for honor? When he went to stop her, however, he suddenly discovered that not a trace of their official flock could be seen in the vacuous, unmanned great hall, leaving behind only him and her. With another look, what great hall? Where he was clearly mist form, which was covered in red muslin curtains. The woman with the striking resemblance to Xiao Heiyu had since come up close, the majority of her outer garments undone, her soft chest half exposed with a bright cinnabar mole at the center of it. Within her eyes was a fogginess, carrying shame and resentment and moving through various kinds of feelings, but with another look, that was all gone, and only a pair of limpid, apricot pit-shaped eyes remained. Upon witnessing this scene, all he could sense was a hot stream rushing into his lower abdomen. The greater part of his immortal and mortal souls had long since been scattered, and he couldn't stop himself from reaching out to embrace the beauty. He then found that the one in his arms was struggling in resistance, which added an even further bit of bone-eroding, soul-dispersing loveliness. He wished he could do nothing more than limply fall with her into this land full of red muslin and warm fragrances, making clouds and rain as they visited shaman mountains together. Yet, in that moment, a chuckle sounded next to him. The laughing person seemed to not yet be fully grown, as their voice was a bit sharp, but it was extremely cold, stabbing one in the heart with chill when it entered their ear. Jian Saizong was frightened into a cold sweat by the sound. The rubbing motions he was incessantly making on the woman he held suddenly stopped, his eyes widening. He felt a pain in his chest as he was pushed away by a huge force. He raised his head to take a look, and, what mist form Xiao Heiyu? What was standing there was clearly a man that had a face full of wrinkles, a shriveled mouth, and maybe two tails of meat on him, the Assistant Minister of Revenue, Sir Zhao Mingji. Not a single person present wasn't dumbstruck and bug-eyed. At the start, they had watched Wuxia mysteriously go seek out Jian Saizong, who had just recently found trouble for him, to talk, the reason yet unclear. At the time, the two's feet were 2 chi apart from each other, and they mutually stared for no more than a moment. They then saw Jian Saizong suddenly draw backwards 2 steps and make to raise his hand forwards to point, though he hadn't yet lifted it up before he was letting it back down. Soon after, his eyes gazed unblinkingly at the vacant great hall ahead of him, and they didn't know who he had seen appear, but a smatter of flush emerged on his face that was obscene no matter how it was looked at or thought about. Soon after that, the antiquated man, who had always been the most observant of etiquette, laughed mischievously, saliva flowing out of the corner of his mouth with an extremely vulgar look in his eyes poles apart from the person who ordinarily had a mouthful of propriety, justice, honor, and humility. Everyone's eyes had honed in. Helian Pei had used all his strength to lean his body forward, itching to get closer for a clear look. Jian Saizong then abruptly made an even more awful move, using one hand to hug the nearby Zhao Mingji like a vicious tiger pouncing on its food. To tell the truth to the heavens and earth, that Sir Zhao Mingji had a face that was so ineffably, universally shocking, it could, at the bare minimum, make gods and ghosts cry and terrify a couple of children. Nevertheless, they witnessed Minister Jian act like he was holding the most beautiful woman in the realm in his arms, an extremely lascivious expression on his face. Just holding him would be enough as it was, but he was also whispering while moving his hands up and down, stuff like xiao heiyu and darling, lovely intermittently coming out of his mouth without cease. Helian Pei was wide-eyed and tongue-tied. It was long time before he said anything, stunned. Where did this come from? Oi, subject Jian, even if you've always had feelings of admiration towards Sir Zhao, you shouldn't disregard that he has a wife and children. Jing Qi just about fell headfirst onto the ground. What came out of His Majesty the Emperor's mouth was alarming, once again sending the almost repositioned rationality of all the officials flying. Jing Qi stealthily withdrew a few steps to the side, his gaze falling upon the shamanette. He thought to himself about how he had just been feeling that the little bastard was nefarious, and then he actually did have some evil magic tricks. The tiny toxic creature was very slight in age and already a vengeance seeker over even angry looks. He would be truly terrible in the future. In this retreat of his, he coincidentally caught sight of Helian Yi lifting his head and looking over to where Wuxia was. He noticed murderous intent flash past the calm-looking youth's face. Since no one came out and spoke at this time, the matter would then intensify. Jian Xizong was still the core power of the eldest Scion's party, and Helian Zhao, who had just been momentarily out of his senses, finally stood up. "Father Emperor," he bellowed in rage, "an appointed official of the dynasty has been messed with like so under everyone's watching eyes. What decorum is this?" The noise of that angry shout finally made everyone there explode into sobriety. Zhao Mingji's face had gone purple-red from choking up, but with his tiny, salted fish-like physique, he truly was unable to push Jian Xizong away after a short time, as the man suddenly wasn't letting old age keep him down like Lian Po. His limbs in a mess, he pushed and snarled, yet there was no response from the other party at all, and his court uniform was even a little under half torn off. Outrageous. An insult to scholardom. An insult. Why is no one coming to drag this evildoer out? Repeated waves of voices burst like a boiler. Helian Pei only coughed lightly, looking at Wuxia with difficulty. He naturally couldn't tow Wuxia out for real, as though the shamanette was weird and strange. He was, in the end, a child. He himself was a magnificent, benevolent ruler, so how could he be so petty as to lower himself to the level of a little kid? Moreover, this stupid incident of performing shaman craft was honestly incited from his own curiosity. Helian Pei generally shouldn't be hitting himself in the face, thus he slammed on the table vigorously. "What are you all making a fuss over?" he shouted. He was the son of heaven, after all. That herd of overly impassioned officials paused, then uniformly knelt down. Wuxia smiled, also kneeling in their wake, though his back was exceptionally straight. Only Helian Zhao, despite currently kneeling, dared to still loudly call out. "Father Emperor! Father Emperor, Minister Jian is still an old official of our great Qing, and someone of high virtue. This is compelling him to strike his head against a stone pillar of this great hall, Father Emperor." Helian Pei coughed, then spoke to Wuxia. "Ah! Nanjiang Shamanette, this is indeed not within decorum. You will undo the spell on Sir Jian, yes. We are aware that your Nanjiang shaman craft is nothing short of formidable. This is nothing but a little trick, Emperor," Wuxia yet said. "I said a type of passion parasite. Our place also calls it one kun immortal trace. Who it's set on, is who will catch sight of the one they're really thinking of inside. In our place, who is thought of is who is going to be good with us, yes. Why do you want to trample it? That's," Helian Pei touched his nose, having no choice but to vaguely decline this. The Central Plains is a land of civilization, and thou all's untamed land is naturally not the same. As you live here, we will of course appoint you a teacher to teach you literacy and principles. You will then understand that there are some things that cannot be done in a public area. Jing Qi tilted his face away, narrowly ruining his integrity solely for that one phrase cannot be done in a public area. In actuality, Helian Pei's base nature could still be regarded as a little benevolent, and a little compassionate. If he wasn't sitting in that dragon throne, he also could have, in actuality, been regarded as a fun person. Wuxia then nodded. So, this can't be done before people. I understand. That one phrase struck at the hearts of however many there were present. They only felt that this Nanjiang Drake was honestly the evil that lingered even after death, so young, yet his mind was ruthless and his words contained mockery. It was plain to see that the intentions he harbored were off track. Wuxia was seen to extend both his hands, and he used them to lightly clap a few times in a certain peculiar rhythm, laughing coldly. That Jian Saizong seemed like he had gotten put into a set pose by someone, his movements promptly stopping. Zhao Mingji seized the opportunity to forcefully push him away as if he was fighting his fate, panting with rough breaths. Jing Qi was conversely livened up from this. Others wouldn't know this, but Jian Saizong was an Axel-esque character in the eldest Scion's party. When he had helped Helian Yi sweep these right-resting brothers clean back in the day, he had both seen with his own eyes and heard with his own ears some number of vile things, so he was naturally aware of what sort of goods this Jian Saizong, with his mouth full of traditional virtues, was. Nevertheless, it was a shame that he'd been purely concerned over open fights and hidden struggles in his previous lifetime. There had been no shamanette that was so standout and irreverent of the ruler to kick up such an exciting event. On the surface, he emitted ignorance as he stood by the emperor's side and pretended not to exist, despite the schadenfreude in his heart being on an intense rise. He calculated how Minister Jian was going to react when his mind cleared up. Zhao Mingji pointed irately at Jian Saizong, his whole body shaking like a sifter and face swelling up, with even those endless ravines of wrinkles all seemingly about to fill up smooth. Half a day went by, but he didn't say a word. Speaking of, the party struggles between every major faction in the court were already restrained productions, but not every single person would be able to find those few stinky shoemakers that shared their own stench. There would forever be a batch of such people that were classified as ignored dogs unloved by both grandmother and uncle, relying on no one and liking no one. Blood was always seen below their mouths, as they caught whoever and bit whoever. By no coincidence, this Sir Zhao was exactly that sort of person. The pathetic man bit people on the daily, opening up his big, bloody basin of a mouth, one bite an accurate one, another a vicious one. The method to figuring out the sacred order of cursing one that ought to be cursed and vilifying one that ought to be vilified was a talent he had perfected, yet right now, his annoyance made him unable to get a single sentence out to the other. All he did was tremble non-stop. Jing Qi was thinking that, regarding his personality, this man was probably going to first elevate this lousy affair to a high degree, then run into a pillar. As expected, he witnessed Sir Zhao roar in rage. What a shameless scoundrel! This grade of beast, preaching virtues on the surface while full of debased thoughts inside, has undeservedly mixed in with court, humiliating an appointed dynasty official in its hall. Though I, Zhao Mingji, am untalented, I have ultimately read a few divinely sanctioned books, and I know what's known as etiquette, justice, honor, and shame. I disdain to associate with such a fawning, unethical person. After he was done being worked up, he indeed went headfirst towards a stone pillar in the great hall. Fortunately, Sir Zhao wasn't young anymore, nor did he have the kind of martiality and vigor that Minister Jian did despite his age, so he couldn't run fast and got pulled to a stop by a multitude of people's limbs. He knelt on the ground, nose snotting and eyes tearing as he tore some howls like "I'm ashamed before the emperor and what will become of my reputation from now on" and such out of his throat. As it turned out, this man's fussing was not any better than a woman's. Helian Pei's skull was soon about to explode from the racket he was making, and he looked wholly emaciated. Jing Qi thus had another pondering. The fussing was going on for so long, Jian Xizong roughly ought to have realized the deception, and this time, it be him running into a pillar. End of the chapter. Stay tuned for more BL.